Mr. Speaker, at this time I'm pleased to yield 5 minutes to the Chairman of the Rules Committee, the gentleman from California, Mr. Dreyer.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. Without objection.
Speaker, I thank my friend from Lawrenceville for his typical stellar management of this very important rule. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, that it saddens me greatly that we are here on the House floor dealing with this. We have been in the midst of what has been a celebration. The celebration is described as the Arab Spring. We saw a few months ago a young merchant in a small town in Tunisia very, very distraught over the fact that a government official came and took his scale away from him and took it to the government office, and he went back and asked for it. And when he made that request, he was denied it. And he basically said he'd had enough. And so this young man chose to set himself afire in the middle of the town square in this tiny town in Tunisia. Now, as we all know, that launched what has become known as the Arab Spring. The Economist magazine very appropriately said that one of the great developments that the Arab Spring has wrought is that we have now seen those so-called barbarians in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, move towards self-determination. Many people in the West and in other parts of the world very arrogantly said, there is no way in the world that those people could possibly make great strides towards political pluralism, the development of the rule of law, self-determination. But in fact, we saw, beginning with this one very sad act, people throughout the Arab world, in not only Tunisia, but Egypt, Bahrain, and yes, in Libya, demonstrate their frustration over authoritarian dictatorships that were actually undermining the potential of the people of each of these countries. And so that's why, Mr. Speaker, it saddens me greatly that we are here today doing what it is that we're doing. Why? Because we should be in the midst of a celebration of these very bold and dynamic steps that are being taken throughout the Arab world. And why is it that we're here? We're here because of what has been described by members on both sides of the aisle as, I just heard my friend from New York describe the actions of this presidency as being the act of a monarch. And now, Mr. Speaker, I think it's very important for us to look at recent history. If we go back to the 2006 election, the Republicans lost the majority in large part because of the war in Iraq. Democrats and Republicans alike acknowledge that. There's an important distinction that needs to be made. If one goes back and looks at the action that was taken by President Bush, he chose to come to this Congress. He wanted the support of the American people through their elected representatives and senators to be behind his effort. We all know that he reached out to the United Nations, built a coalition, and there was lots of controversy. There to this day continues to be controversy. But the Congress was involved in that process, as has been the case in many instances in the past. Not every instance, but many instances in the past. We know, as my friend from Grandfather Community, North Carolina, just said, that President Obama, when he was a candidate as a United States Senator, was very critical of President Bush. We know that his campaign for the presidency, in large part, centered around this notion of bringing home the troops, and we had his speech night before last on dealing with Afghanistan, and his notion that we were going to bring these efforts to an end. Now, I would argue, Mr. Speaker, that as we, I said, should be in the midst of celebrating the Arab Spring, we probably would have had, when one thinks about the actions that took place in Libya, we probably would have had, Mr. Speaker, pretty broad support here in the Congress for the action that was taken by the President. If there had been an early authorization of this. Now, it is, as I said, very sad that we are here now because I think Democrats and Republicans alike acknowledge that this has been very, very poorly handled. Now, Mr. Speaker, I don't know if there's
I'd be
any more
happy to
time.
yield 2 additional minutes to the
The
chairman.
gentleman is recognized for 2 additional minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I thank my friend for yielding. And let me just say that as we look at this, Mr. Speaker, I think that we need to recognize that there are other very troubled spots in the world. We just today have gotten word of thousands of Syrians who are fleeing to Turkey because of the barbaric acts that have taken place there. And so I think that as we look at the great positive steps that have been taken in the Arab world, we need to make sure that the United States Congress and the President of the United States are in this together. There should be consultation and authorization to deal with this. And, Mr. Speaker, I've got to say that as we look at this rule itself, I really am absolutely stunned at the kinds of things that I've heard from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle. Now, Mr. Speaker, as my good friend from Rochester, New York, Ms. Slaughter, knows, as we began the debate on this, we've had complete compliance with the 3-day layover requirement. And we have these measures before us. And I would say to my friend from Rochester, Mr. Speaker, there was not a single amendment offered in the Committee on Rules to deal with this. Not a single amendment offered. And in fact, one of these measures is offered by a Republican, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Rooney. The other is offered by a Democrat, the other gentleman from Florida, Mr. Hastings. And so when I think about 3 o'clock in the morning on June 26th of 2009, we'd begun on in 2005, June 25th of 2009, we began the debate on this horrible idea of cap and trade. And it was 3 o'clock in the morning that I was sitting upstairs with my Rules Committee colleagues, Mr. Speaker, and dropped in my lap, still hot because it had just come off of the copying machine, was 300 pages of an amendment that we reported out and came, I'm sorry.
For 2 additional minutes.
I thank my friend for yielding. And Mr. Speaker, let me just say, at 3 o'clock in the morning, we were handed this measure. Now, what we have before us has, again, complied with the 3-day layover requirement. Not a single amendment was offered, and there's a proposal offered by a Democrat and a proposal offered by a Republican. And so, Mr. Speaker, I have to say that I believe that this rule is one that does allow for a free-flowing debate. It allows for an opportunity to consider this, and it's not as if we haven't been engaged in this discussion for a long period of time. My friend from Cleveland is here, and he has played a very, very constructive role in leading the charge on this over the past several weeks, as he often does. And I believe that our ability to continue this debate is an important one. But again, Mr. Speaker, let me just conclude by saying it saddens me that at a time when we should be celebrating the fact that there are people in the Arab world who are seeking the opportunity to enjoy the kinds of freedoms that we have here in the United States of America, that the President of the United States has chosen to go it alone without recognizing the very, very important responsibility of the first branch of the United States government. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. The gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
The right to protect civilians has morphed into the so-called right to change a regime and the right to destroy civilians. The situation is positively Orwellian, and it's all going wrong. Even early supporters of the war are changing their minds. I would quote from Al Jazeera just a couple days ago. Italy's foreign minister and the outgoing head of the Arab League have each called for a halt to hostilities in the war-torn North African country. Franco Frattini told members of Parliament on Wednesday that the suspension of military operations in Libya was essential for immediate humanitarian aid, and Amir Moussa, the Arab League chief, called for a political solution to the crisis. Moussa's sentiment was shared by the Italian foreign minister, who called for urgent humanitarian aid to trapped residents in cities like Tripoli and Misurata. He said the people in those areas face a dramatic humanitarian situation, and added that a suspension of hostilities would also avoid consolidating a division of Libya between East and West. He said he hoped the European Council in Brussels on Thursday would highlight an end to the fighting in Libya as a practical solution. The question is, Mr. Speaker, will Congress rush into the breach here while our allies are headed to the exit? H.R. 2278 by Mr. Rooney would immediately prevent the administration from engaging in direct offensive hostilities in Libya, and it ought to be supported. Now, the resolution isn't perfect. It doesn't end the war in its entirety immediately. But it does make clear that the United States will not take over the war as European support continues to diminish. I propose an amendment with Representative Amish of Michigan and 11 others to the Defense Authorization Bill that would eliminate all funds for military operations in Libya. I urge a vote for this bipartisan amendment when we come back after the recess. H.R. 2278 and the Kucinich-Amash amendment are complementary. If we want to end U.S. involvement, we can do it in two steps. First step, vote for H.R. 2278. Second step, vote for Kucinich-Amash when we come back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves his time. Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentlelady. I thank the Speaker. I stand here this morning as someone who has opposed the Iraq War and consistently opposed the Afghanistan War under both Republican and Democratic presidents. I think it is important to stop the politics this morning and recognize that mistakes were made by presidents of all political parties. The War Powers resolution that is now being debated as being unconstitutional by my Republican friends has a very strong purpose. It is the purpose of this joint resolution to fulfill the intent of the framers of the Constitution of the United States and ensure that the collective judgment of both the Congress and the President will apply to the introduction of United States armed forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly going to occur. Now we have Republicans suggesting that the War Powers resolution is unconstitutional. What do they want? This is a political game. I voted for Mr. Kucinich's resolution, and the Republicans had the opportunity to also vote for Mr. Kucinich's resolution. This is to embarrass the President. Now, I agree with the underlying sentiment that this was handled badly and that there should have been consultation. Now there is an opportunity for authorization. We need to debate this, not whether it is President Obama, but whether or not there is a collaborative effort between NATO's and the Arab League to address this hostile situation in Libya. And frankly, I don't like the politics of this. The politics says it's okay if it's a Republican president, but not okay if it's Mr. Obama. I am interested in preserving the integrity of this Constitution and have consistently voted that Congress has a right to declare war. But we are now engaged in a consultation process, and I hope members will engage in the debate on the basis of the right decision to make. I am against war. Bring the troops home from Afghanistan. End the war in Iraq. But right now, this should not be Republicans against Democrats on the question of whether or not we are in a collaborative effort with NATO on this issue of Libya. We are attempting to save lives. Take the politics out of it.
Gentlelady's time.
Happy to yield the gentlelady an additional minute.
Gentlelady is recognized for 1 additional minute.
I thank the distinguished gentlelady. I went to the Libyan embassy at the very start of this horrific crisis and stood with the Libyan ambassador that resigned and called for the resignation of General Gaddafi. Today, I continue to call for the cessation of violence and the violence and abuse against the Libyan people. But we have to address this question away from the cloud, as I indicated, of politics. We must adhere to the Constitution, Congress's right to declare war, but I can't understand this now backside debate about the War Powers resolution being constitutional. For some of us, we believe that the contents of it insist that it is. So my point to my colleagues is the Kucinich resolution was on the floor, and every Republican had the opportunity to vote for it. Why we are here again with a resolution that imitates the debate that we had, I believe the underlying principle and premise is to embarrass this administration
Gentlelady's
and
time
President
expired.
Obama. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume to say
Gentleman is
I
recognized.
absolutely agree with the gentlelady. This is no place for politics.